In this video, we'll learn how to make an interactive pattern using loops and conditionals in p5js. When combined, loops and conditionals are two of the most powerful control structures for making interaction, animation, and complexity with very little code. Here's a variation on the nested loop example with a couple of small differences. At the top, I've added three variables. Space x controls the horizontal spacing between columns. Space y controls the vertical spacing between rows, and diam controls the size of each circle. I've plugged those into each of my outer and inner for loops, and the ellipse function respectively. What I'd like to do here is have different behaviors for my circles based on how closely they're each being drawn to the mouse. So I know that I have access to the mouse x and mouse y variables. I've also got access to the x and y variables that are setting the location of each of my ellipses. I'd like to also make a local variable inside my inner loop and use that to store the distance from each circle's center to wherever the mouse happens to be. So we'll call this variable d, and to figure this out, I'm going to use the distance function, which is abbreviated dist. We can imagine when we're using the distance function that we're drawing a line in between 2 points, but instead of showing up on screen, the dist function just tells us how long that line is in pixels. So the coordinates for my first point will be the mouse x and mouse y. The coordinates for my second point will be x and y. So this gives us access to the distance between each circle and wherever that mouse happens to be on screen. Then we can use that variable to make a conditional. So maybe let's say if d is less than 100, set the fill to red. Else, set the fill to white. What we're saying with this conditional is that circles drawn within 100 pixels of the mouse should be filled red, and any circles farther away should be filled white. Notice as I move my mouse over the canvas, it's surrounded by a 100 pixel radius area of circles, all filled red. Now I can see it's not quite a perfect circle, and that's because there's a little bit of space in between each of the circles in my grid. As some circles on the outer edge of that 100 pixel radius fall in or out of that first conditional test, that's what gives me this sort of snapping action. So I've already got some nice interaction here, and I could take this a step further by also using this distance variable to manipulate the diameter of my circles as they get closer to the mouse. So rather than just switch red or white, I'd like to have my circles that are closest to the mouse increase in size, and circles that are farther away from the mouse be smaller. Now I've already got this variable diam, and that's controlling the diameter of each of my circles on the grid. So I can take that and change it using the map function. So I'll be mapping that d variable, which I know is going to be in the range of 0 to 100, because to even get into this first block of my conditional, it has to be less than 100. And I'd like to map that into a range so that the circles drawn closest to the mouse are larger than 10, and circles drawn toward the outer edge of that 100 pixel area are smaller than 10. So I'm actually going to start my newly mapped range with something larger, let's say 50, and take it down to 1. Then in our else block, I'll make sure to set diam back to 10. So any circles that are not inside that 100 pixel radius from the mouse should always be 10 pixels wide and 10 pixels high. So you can see I'm getting some of that interesting diameter shift towards the edge of my 100 pixel area around the mouse. And to see the central circles a bit more clearly, we can just make a little adaptation to our red fill color. Let's add a fourth argument, which will control the alpha, or the transparency of that fill. I'll set this to about 100. Now we can start to see how those circles are overlapping and interacting with one another as I move the mouse. And remember, circles that are drawn closer to the mouse get a bigger radius, and circles that are farther from the mouse but still within that 100 pixel radius are drawn smaller. So that's a great example of how we can take our existing knowledge of variables, the map function, and conditionals, and combine it with loops to get some really interesting interaction with just a little bit of code.